everything that we do in the conservation department and all of the research that we do is to make sure that that collection remains stable for as long as possible so that people can come to the museum and immerse themselves in Tudor life.
These statistical ecologists have spent years passionately developing advanced mathematical models that are now being used in the field to map and manage butterfly populations across the world.
I've been working for, 7 years or so on a fascinating publication called The Ladies Magazine, a hugely popular monthly magazine for women. I would certainly argue the first recognisably modern women's magazine.
We're working together with University of Kent and other partners to really make it a real vaccine that you can use. The product is right here and not just in papers.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Series 2 of Next Generation Impact. Early this year, for our first series, we examined all aspects of the impact agenda. This series will look deeper into aspects around how to measure impact. As we recover from the last submission to the Research Excellence Framework, we'll ask how we can value the broad range of impacts that universities have and explore national impact through international collaboration. To kick this series off, we will also be taking a look at the perspectives on measuring impact post-REF. Seeing that research impact now holds a central role in our research culture and environment, we want to find out how different universities and different people face these challenges that these bring and where our panel understand the future of impact. So let's introduce our panel. Joining us on the line are Dr. Rebecca Cassidy from the Centre for Health Service Studies here at the University of Kent, Dr. Alexandra Leduc-Pargel, who is the Research and Innovation Manager for the Division of Human and Social Sciences at the University of Kent, and Research Funding and Impact Consultant, Dr. Stephen Kemp. If you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, you can also join in with the discussion by sending us any questions on the sidebars, and we can bring these to the attention of panel members. You can also tweet your questions and comments using the hashtag NextGenerationImpact. Rebecca, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit about your work on impact.
Hi, Alex, thank you. I'm Rebecca Cassidy and I work as a qualitative researcher in the Centre for Health Services Studies, but I'm also a research advisor for RDS Southeast, the Research Design Service. And through that role, I've got engaged in a National Impact Champion programme, which is across all the different RDSs across the country, and also links us into a programme of training and research across the NIHR family. And that's a great opportunity to link into and learn from the ongoing impact work that they are currently doing.
Thanks, Rebecca. Alexandra, let's come to you. What about your role on impact?
Well, up until submission of the last REF last year, I was responsible for developing some impact case studies. There were 2 impact case studies in social anthropology, 1 in biological anthropology, and 2 in geography and environmental studies. I have now a broader remit as research and innovation manager for the division, in the sense that I focus mostly on social sciences, but more disciplines, including political sciences, economics, and psychology. And I will carry on in the next cycle, supporting researchers with their impact endeavors in the division for the coming years.
Thanks, Alexandra. Finally, Stephen, what can you tell us about your role and your work on impact?
Call myself a research funding and impact consultant, and that's because I work with people on research funding and impact. So on the funding side, I'm mainly focused on research councils and helping people win grants, particularly helping them to integrate impact into their research plans and kind of use that as part of the sell. But then on the impact side, I focus on helping people prepare for impact assessment exercises like the REF, So this goes from training right through to actual help with the real nitty-gritty of the document preparation. And I think over the last few years, I have been involved in about 400 case studies, I think, both in the UK and in other places. And this, I think, is an interesting feature given our conversation today, that places like Hong Kong, Australia, Poland are starting to adopt the kind of UK style case study approach, which is interesting. My background is in chemistry. I've worked at EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and I've worked at the University of Southampton, both in research funding and impact roles. So that's me.
Thanks, Stephen. Drawing on this amazing breadth of experience you have, perhaps you could talk in general about the challenges that universities face when measuring and evaluating impact.
Yes. Well, I think the biggest challenge is around understanding what is impact in the first place. It's easy to come up with a broad, sweeping definition, as for example the REF definition is. It's more difficult to say what does that mean, what is impact in any specific context or within a particular project context. So once you have decided what you think the impact is, you then have to work out how exactly you're going to describe that. So I think they're the main challenge, is actually articulating what it is, and then deciding what kinds of indicators you can use to show that. Then obviously you've got the difficulty of actually gathering that information, those indicators, that evidence to make a case.
Yeah, the struggle we all went through in the last REF, and we're hoping this webinar will help people prepare for the next one. Rebecca, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the National Institute of Health Research, its vision of impact and how that's measured.
Right. So they have a kind of rolling process at the moment. They're undergoing a kind of whole ecosystem look at their self-evaluation. So I guess my engagement with that is both being able to engage with that kind of overarching process, which is very interesting, and also as a research advisor, my personal role is obviously giving researchers and research teams advice, as Stephen was saying, about how to embed impact into their research. And I've also become involved in a project with the NIHR looking at how they support their panel members to assess those applications, and so trying to kind of tally those things up. So I guess it's a whole research life cycle approach. But yeah, I think the NIHR vision at the moment is really changing. They're looking across a very varied and large organisation, and trying to think about what does good impact look like, what's meaningful, and also looking at trying to anticipate their own information and evidence needs and adjust according to that for the different programs that they're evaluating. So really a process of going through team by team, where they have programs as diverse as global health and innovation in AI. So a real range of different things for which impact is obviously very different.
Thanks, Rebecca. Alexandra, maybe I could ask you about that. Are there specific challenges around impact in the disciplines that you work with?
Yes, definitely. There are two things I can bring up here. A major challenge that we face at the beginning anyways, for disciplines where the culture of impact was less developed than for other disciplines. We found that there was often lack of understanding of the difference between pathways to impact and impact itself. And so we found ourselves often in discussion with researchers saying, no, but this is pathways to impact, it's not impact itself. I think it relates to the second point I can bring up about challenges. I think a very significant challenge that we faced was for public engagement. It was very difficult to assess the impact on the public as such. And for the case studies I was working on, we found there was a limited use of surveys. And I felt that my institution was quite reluctant to showcase great examples of public engagement, but that had weak evidence. And this is something that I naturally understood, but there was definitely a problem there. And in the end, we kind of almost turned away from public engagement activity because it wasn't perceived to be as effective in leading to impact itself. So, do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean. I was just wondering what indicators were valued and useful to you in that submission.
Well, the most useful ones were qualitative measures, and in particular letters of testimony, especially when we could help the beneficiary to contextualize the impact itself. There was a real opportunity there for us to bring out the impact and give real quality to the narrative we were developing in section 4 of the template.
Stephen, is this a common problem that you find in how to describe and present impact, that it's difficult to move from pathways to actual impacts and how to evidence those impacts? A question for Stephen, if I may.
Right.
So that was a question for Stephen, if that's all right.
Pardon, can you repeat the question, Alex, please?
The question is this issue that Alexandra's raised about the difference between pathways to impact and impact itself, and what indicators of impact itself one can use.
Yeah, well, I think we have this, always have this sort of conflict, don't we? That academics and universities are asked to show the impact of their research, but they're not really in control of the context in which the impact happens, or they're not responsible for that problem. Do you see what I mean? Yes. So, in a way, asking universities to describe the impact of their research out there in the real world is a bit unfair, because it's not something they can really control. What can they control? They can control who they talk to about their research, the ways in which they digest their research for those target audiences, the routes by which they put research findings out there, the kinds of information they use as inputs to research. All these kinds of things they can control, and that's the engagement side of it, isn't it? That's the pathway. So I think the focus on pathways comes from the fact that universities and academics can control the pathway to an extent. They can't control the actual impact. But when it comes to assessment exercises, the onus is on universities and academics to show that impact. I think that's where the difficulty comes. And obviously then you're back into the quality of engagement and the quality of the planning to provide you with the links you need to stakeholders, the kind of mechanisms that you set out in the first place to monitor and evaluate how things are going. Yeah, all of that comes to bear at the end of well, when I say at the end, I mean at the evaluation stage of the process, where you're looking back and saying, what have we actually achieved? What have we managed to deliver? So I think there is a difficulty in the mismatch between pathways to impact that universities, academics can control, and the impact itself, which is out there. But it can be made easier by having those good relationships in place and by thinking everything through at the outset.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because that relates back to what Rebecca was saying about preparing for impact over the life cycle of a research project. And Rebecca, could you say a bit more about how people can approach that?
Yeah, so I guess from the outset, the NIH are interested in people establishing the need for their research very clearly. Without establishing need, it's very difficult to claim that impact later. PPI, so patient and public involvement, so that kind of broader engagement with people, and other stakeholders. So making sure that if you need commissioners, obviously I'm talking about health research, but people to implement your research, that you've got those people engaged really from the outset, and having that dialogue. They want to see obviously a pathway, a kind of connected set of activities which reach some clearly articulated goals. One issue that's raised sometimes with people's research applications is that you can have different layers of goals, kind of more achievable short-term goals, medium-term goals, and everybody would like to impact and change the NICE guidelines, for example, but that's probably a longer term goals. So being realistic about the incremental goals and how you're going to mobilise the knowledge that you find in order to meet those with these partnerships, I guess. The other thing that's important to think about is the resource, and I think it's important that funders like NIHR are coming around to the understanding that funding bids do need to properly resource this kind of engagement if it's going to be effective.
Thanks, Rebecca. We actually did discuss some of these issues around the measurement of impact in the previous series of Next Generation Impact. So we'd just like to show you a clip from Dr. Tina Hoax, where she discusses some of these issues. I'm hoping we can see the clip from Dr. Tina Hoax where she discusses some of these issues around measuring impact from our previous series of Next Generation Impact.
I would say that for many of us, it's very important. I think for many of us, that's why we went into academia, because we wanted to do high quality research, independent research that could influence government and that could speak for people who perhaps at that point in time don't have a voice themselves. And while I hear all the critical views that have been expressed about impact and how we view it now, I think I'd also like to say that the last impact exercise in 2014, when we first had to demonstrate what impact we have as academics, I think has shown positively how much impact academics have had over decades. Before it was fashionable, before we all talked about it, before they got rewarded, and what long-standing engagement with stakeholders people have had. So I think for many of us, that's very important. I'd also think there's a new generation for whom they now have the opportunities to do that straight away. They use Twitter a lot to communicate. They apply for funding with other organizations. So there's a project, for example, called COVID Realities, which is applying with the Child Poverty Action Group together. And that's driven by funders as much as anything. So while the REF is important, I think the role of research funders who are requiring impact as part of the application has changed the environment fundamentally too.
It's interesting to hear Tina talking about the variety of impacts that research can have. Stephen, perhaps I could ask you about whether different types of impact require different frameworks of assessment.
That's a really, I think, quite a big question, isn't it? So we've already heard Rebecca say that the even within the realms of NIHR research, there's a need to really do something bespoke for each kind of research area, because there are different needs. And obviously, if you take that out of the sort of health and medical sphere and extrapolate it across all of the areas of research, right? If you look down the list of units of assessment, all those different areas, there's so much breadth there that there's no simple or specific framework that can be used for understanding the breadth of that impact. So what we have in the REF assessment is a very broad, and some would say one size fits all way of assessing impact. But I think the breadth of the format, the format of it in terms of a narrative that allows people to put forward what they think the impact is in their terms and in the terms that their stakeholders and beneficiaries recognise, I think is probably the only, well, I say the only, it's probably a pretty good way to go in terms of dealing with the sheer breadth that is there. So yes, there are critics of the current way of doing things in the UK REF, the 4-page or 5-page case study approach, but there aren't a great deal of other better ideas for how to deal with this problem. And if you move to, for example, frameworks of metrics, then you obviously then privilege certain kinds of research and certain kinds of impact, and you will knock down any areas that cannot be expressed in those terms. And I think that if you look at any area of research, you could not put a simple set of metrics of quantitative indicators down to understand the full breadth and to see the excellence in all areas, say, of chemistry or of history. Yeah, so everything needs to be considered on its own merits, I would say. And that is probably, if we're being generous, what the REF narrative approach to assessing impact is trying to do. Obviously, there are issues there in the way things are sort of codified to make the system workable, to make it a process, may privilege certain things, but there are, there are some compromises there. But I would say broadly, the way things are done at the moment is the most inclusive, or as approaching as inclusive as it could be. Obviously, I will let other people argue with that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because a recent article in the journal Studies in Higher Education by Justina Bandola-Gill and Kat Smith argued that the REF risks narrowing what we value and recognise as impact, and focusing only on those quantitative metrics that enable the telling of simple stories of impact that solves problems, rather than reframing issues or doing that public engagement work. Alexandra, you mentioned a bit about this, about how difficult it is to recognise public engagement through the REF thinking on impact. Is there something more we should be doing outside the REF or beyond the REF to value these types of impacts?
Yes, definitely, but I'm afraid I haven't got an answer for you, Alex. I just faced the problem myself, and we kind of left public engagement activities on the side for a while because we couldn't come with strong evidence. Reach wasn't a problem, but it's the significance of public engagement that is particularly difficult to evidence. I mean, obviously, there are some types of impact that rely heavily on qualitative data and will require their own framework, but I believe that public engagement work should probably have its own framework. It probably needs developing. There's definitely a need to integrate public engagement better in the impact agenda.
So what do you do with public engagement activities when describing them for the REF?
Well, I don't have the feeling that we do very well, actually, because we do our best to describe the reach, which I say is not very much of a problem, because we can come up with data on the number of people that were exposed to the research. But when it comes to the significance, it's a whole other matter. And we have tried to capture the significance through surveys. But in the particular impact case study that I'm talking about, the surveys were of a limited use here. The questions we could ask the public were fairly simple, and we're not able to capture a lot of nuances that would have made our case study, that would have added depth to our case study, which is in the end what we were looking for.
Mm-hmm. This builds with some of the criticism that's come to the REF from some international perspectives. So for the 2014 REF, international panel members of main panel A said that they were cautious about how attempts to metricize the evaluation of many aspects of the REF would actually damage some of the good impacts that were visible to them, even if not in the metrics. What's your view on that, Stephen? Are we in danger of damaging impact by over-metricizing it?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And that's why, as the metric tide authors cautioned, we should not seek to metricize these things too far. Obviously, metrics are useful in helping to show certain effects or back up certain claims, but you cannot metricize everything. I think that there is always going to be a natural tendency that if you open up a field and say, tell us about your impacts, then there will be things like economic impacts, or at least those that can be expressed in economic terms, which start to float to the top and become more privileged than the more qualitative and diffuse impacts like you might see in public engagement. That is a risk, but I think that's something about the way that panels judge and use that information rather than an inherent weakness in the process. I would be worried about taking public engagement type impacts outside of the ref impact process, and do you see what I mean? And coming up with some alternative process, because then I think that kind of others public engagement. Often public engagement is part of a wider suite of activities which are required to deliver an impact. So there might be something about convincing policymakers, for example, that you have a problem by analysing a current policy framework. There might be another finding out of that research that is around key findings and sort of killer stats that convince the public that there is a need to do something, which creates another form of sort of impetus for policy actors to do something. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully there might be some impact at the end where at the end of the case study, that is not necessarily the end of the at the end of time, but some case study at the point when you some impact at the point when you write the case study that is around all these different forms of engagement coming together to lead to some result. I think that's partly the issue that we see with public engagement, that we have this, often you can show a conceptual kind of impact. We have changed the way that people see this issue. We've caused them to think about it in a different way, or we've given them the sort of ammo they need to go away and sort of advocate for for that particular change. The issue is whether we see that the behaviour change coming from that, or see them advocating for some policy change or whatever it is that comes from that public engagement. We see the outcomes, which is the increase in awareness and the willingness to change behaviour. We don't see the ultimate impact, which is, do they change behaviour? Does the awareness cause other things to happen? And then can we point to instrumental changes? I think that's the issue. And by that point, things are so diffuse, you can't relate it back to a single piece of research or the work of a single group of a group of people within a university.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Alexandra, do you want to add to this?
I totally agree with Steve. I think that was a good condensed exposition of the problem with public engagement.
I suppose we're talking partly about how far along this pathway from the research to the eventual outcome we can get when describing it for REF and other audiences. Rebecca, perhaps I can ask you about something that interests me about particularly health research and the balance of demonstrating impact through more economic types of evaluations and the value of public engagement, and specifically for health in patient and public involvement, and how one demonstrates the impacts that might have.
Well, I think it's interesting, the engagement that I've had with the NIHR. Their work on PPI, on public engagement, is very well developed, and for those people who've applied through those streams, it's something that is a really big part of the application, to demonstrate PPI engagement all the way from developing a research question, in developing your application, and how that's going to work all the way through your research project. So I think for me in that engagement, it's been quite striking how for certainly the NIHR, that public engagement, as well as their ongoing kind of EDI work, is very much linked to how they view and are developing a new view, if you like, of how impact is working. In terms of how you demonstrate that, it really depends on the research programme. I think that they look in terms of the kind of the people actually engaged, and obviously engaged with meaningfully, and how that's resourced, as I said before, and how that's embedded within research. Certainly different methodologies now in terms of co-production, and how people are being engaged in terms of both prioritising their own research questions, and then obviously that builds through to make impact easier, I guess, if it's the research that people want to happen on the issues that are important to them.
Yeah, thanks. Alexandra, perhaps I could ask you about this and the role of publics that your research is about in actually influencing the agenda that your research might have an impact on. Is that something you work with in your disciplines?
Yes, definitely. I was fortunate enough to work on impact case studies in social anthropology, and the audience there was very diverse and from other countries, and it brings its own challenges as well. Yes, definitely. On the other side, I also had to work with on case studies in the environmental sciences, and that was completely different from work in social anthropology, where we were no longer interacting there with specific communities at a very individual level almost. We were interacting more with NGOs. So yes, the audience is very diverse depending on the disciplines that we work on. I've been only exposed to a small number of disciplines myself, but for the coming cycle, I will be exposed to more disciplines such as economics and politics, and I'm looking forward to see actually which audiences we will encounter there.
Well, Stephen, you've worked a lot across a very wide range of disciplines and perhaps the only natural scientist amongst us. Perhaps you could tell us more about how this balance between involving the public in setting the research agenda as well as audiences for impact works when we're thinking about the natural sciences.
Yeah, so specifically in the context of the natural environment, I think it comes down to research that focuses on particular areas may have a particular community kind of interest. So when we talk about natural environment, for example, you might be talking about areas of outstanding natural beauty, maybe coastal communities that are under threat through climate change. And so I would say that involving those communities, or even advocacy groups who are effectively volunteers, members of the public who are interested in a certain issue, involving them really brings that public sort of voice and experience into the kind of research planning. It's easy to, as an academic, look at the literature, look at policy debates and kind of and data, I suppose, and formulate your research questions from there. But if you bring in members of the public as well, you probably will get some more interesting and left field ideas of what is at stake, what people are interested in, that kind of thing. And I think that can really add another dimension to your research. Certainly, if you are looking to achieve impact, then considering the questions that people are interested in the first place is really important.
Another source of prioritisation could be the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm just interested in your views, Stephen, about how researchers might be able to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals into the impacts that they're having.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting area because people are talking more about them as a sort of lens by which to focus and prioritize and also evaluate policy measures, but also things like research programs. So it's easy to look at the Sustainable Development Goals and think that they are very high level and almost to the point of meaninglessness. But underneath those are loads of targets, which are, well, some of them are quite specific. And so I think if researchers are looking at how they might rationalize their research or how they might choose specific targets, then definitely going through those Sustainable Development Goals, looking at the targets underneath them and seeing if their work can feed into either broadly in a rationale sort of sense or directly. If they can feed into those targets, then that is a strong way to make a case for your research in a funding sort of sense, but also to be very specific about what you want to achieve if you are looking to achieve certain outcomes or drive towards a certain agenda.
Yes.
So
I think being very specific in that way is quite important there. I don't know if you've worked with that funder, Stephen, but there's the Darwin Initiative Fund, which has one of its for which projects have to link to the SDGs. They actually ask from researchers to submit a very detailed log frame, which I think could be possibly extended to any researcher who would like to link their research to the SDGs in that way.
Yeah,
Thanks.
if I could, sorry, just to jump in, I think so. My background is in global health, and I think a lot of ODA funding, historically, you have had to very explicitly link into the SDGs. But one of the great strengths of the SDGs, apart from the fact that all of the goals link across and between each other, helping researchers see those links, is that actually they, rather than the Millennium Development Goals, which were very low and middle income specific, these Sustainable Development Goals are specifically for everybody. They're for us and this country and Europe and so on. So I think it would be a good aim to look at how they apply across all research funding, not just that's specifically for low and middle income countries.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that are coming into us via social media. The first one's from Sundar Mahendra, and they ask, is it possible to borrow methods and approaches from programme evaluation to measure impact? Maybe I could start with you on that, Rebecca.
Goodness, yes. I mean, it's in terms of what I've been observing, and I am a kind of external observer at the NIHR, they obviously talk a lot about metrics when they're looking at their program, so a research funding program, and how they view that as a success. What does success look like? There's obviously all of the normal things, outcomes and publications, alt metrics. But interestingly, they also look at things like the number of PIs who are early career researchers, so slightly non-standard metrics, if you like, that demonstrate broader outcomes, which possibly could cross over between programs and individual research projects in terms of that kind of capacity building and so on.
Thanks, Rebecca. Stephen, perhaps I could ask you about this as well. Do you see particular evaluation methods that people are applying when looking at the impact of their research?
Sorry, what was the first part of that?
The question is about particular approaches to evaluation and whether we can borrow them from programme evaluation to evaluating impact. Are there any particular approaches to evaluation that you found particularly useful?
I think that I like to have quite a simple approach to evaluation, which it really is, what do you think the impact has been and how do you show that? So in terms of what do you think the impact has been, that can involve talking to stakeholders who have, people who have been involved in or benefited from the research to set those parameters, what the impacts might look like, and then really being pragmatic about the kinds of indicators you could use to do that. So I think I might be a bit giving out the wrong messages in saying this, but I think for demonstrating impact in the REF process, they are looking to reward good stuff wherever it happens. Okay, so you really want to be expressing that in the most powerful way you can, in whatever terms you can cobble together. So I would say a more rounded evaluation, a proper robust academic type evaluation process will be looking to identify both the positive and the negative things. And so I would say aspects of program evaluation would help you, get out the nuggets that you need for a REF impact case study, for example. But you'd also find a lot more rounded information that you may not pull out simply if you were focused on an impact case study. So I think that's another one of the criticisms of the REF process, is that it focuses too heavily on the positive outcomes and doesn't look at the negative or unintended consequences. So that's one to be discussed, I guess.
Well, it's been being discussed by a question that's come in from Anna Tremaine. Perhaps I could put this to you, Alexandra. Anna asks, do you see impact case studies as an opportunity to showcase your research, or as something unwanted by academics and forced upon them?
I had it all actually in the school where I used to work. They were part of the school where the research culture, even after the first cycle. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me? All right. I was saying that I had it all in the school where I was working. There were, I'd say, some disciplines that were more applied, where the research impact culture was well developed, and there were other sides of the school where that was dealing with other disciplines, where researchers were finding that it was a process that was imposed on them, and some of them even had theoretical argument um, to uh, to give me, even though I was trying to explain that all that is required really is to expose the wider significance of their research, and that is not a matter of a specific discipline or another. Every researcher should be able to explain the wider significance of their research. And after a number of years working on impact case studies and more generally exposing researchers to impact, the more reluctant ones actually changed. I'm happy to say I have seen over a period of 3-4 years a real change in culture happening. And I like to think that now it's probably done. I think most researchers in my division would see the benefits of being able to articulate the wider significance of their own research.
Thanks, Alexandra. We've got another question come in from Ritika Ogilvie. They ask, public engagement is one pathway to impact, just as commercialisation or policy engagement. So I'm curious about why why are we thinking that we need to assess public engagement separately? Stephen, do we need to assess public engagement separately, or is it just a pathway to other forms of impact?
I like to keep things simple, so I think it's just one of the general pathways. Okay, I think the issue is that it's difficult to really articulate in any clear sense what the impact of public engagement might be.
Exactly.
That's the issue. So you can talk about, say, the impact of changing an environmental policy, like working with policymakers to implement some environmental policy. You can talk about the impact of that in many flashy, eye-catching ways, which include monetary ways. You can talk about the impact of some commercial engagement by the numbers of units sold, but with that incorporate some technology that's come from research, the amount of revenue that's being produced, the places these things are used. It's all very eye-catching. Often public engagement is much more subtle, and it's about changing the way that particular groups of people think about an issue, or at its best, it is about changing the way that people think about a particular issue, or taking on board those feelings and incorporating them into your research. Now, the way that you describe that impact is never going to be as flashy as selling millions of pounds worth of TVs incorporating some new display technology. But that doesn't mean it's less important.
Yeah, having said that, I like to think myself that the impact case studies will be assessed by a panel who know the discipline in question, and so we'll be able to have a fair view. For example, I noted that there were very little impact case studies in biological anthropology in the previous exercise, and there are specific reasons for that, I believe. And I like to think that even if the case studies presented to an anthropology panel were not as eye-catching as others in, for example, the natural sciences, that the panel itself would be able to calibrate that in a way that is fair.
Great.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and with the approach being very broad, the assessment approach being very broad, tell us what impact you think you've had and show us some information to back that up, it means you are relying on panel members to be well briefed and to be able to understand the full range of information they might get, and to be able to digest all of that, moderate it, and give it the credit it deserves.
Exactly.
Thanks, Stephen. We've had quite a specific question, or perhaps even suggestion, come in from Catherine Blackadder of Sussex University. And she asks, has anyone used or encountered successful longitudinal public engagement evidence gathering by, for example, postcodes to yourself or your future self? Can we look at public engagement over the long term in these sorts of ways? I'm familiar with an example of research that's done in my department that does use that approach with Ray Parle, a sociologist from the University of Kent back in the 70s and 80s, who did a fascinating project on the Isle of Sheppey, where school pupils wrote letters to their future selves. And then more than 20 years later, my colleague Dawn Lyon went and found those school pupils in their middle age and showed them some of these letters. And the reaction they had to them was absolutely fascinating, and a really interesting way of engaging people with the sociology of everyday life and how things work out across the life course. So I think Catherine's suggestion here of using these sorts of longitudinal approaches is a really interesting one. But has anyone else come across longitudinal ways of measuring public engagement or other forms of impact?
No, not me. I haven't.
Rebecca, I suppose this is there's research across the life course in health service studies. I was wondering if you can think about the impacts that research can have over a really long time period and how we can demonstrate that.
Goodness, I can't think of any examples. I think one of the biggest problems with public engagement is the life cycle of research and short-term projects which truncate that kind of engagement. And I think through the university, through various different panels that we have who actually engage with people here and keep them engaged as a kind of rolling membership outside of specific projects is the only kind of long-term engagement that's really possible, because the funding mechanisms unfortunately tend to prevent that longer term engagement, and specifically longer term engagement which would encourage and ensure the involvement of less often heard groups who don't tend to engage in research.
Yes, there's definitely a resource issue. I'm finding myself as an administrator when it comes to developing impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question that's come in from Michelle Lerner at Glasgow Caledonian University about whether we should be measuring impact by using third-party organisations outside the university rather than relying on universities to make these claims about their own impacts. What do you think about that, Stephen?
That is an interesting one. So I have to imagine what that might look like. So that would be effectively some auditors coming along and grilling universities on what they've achieved.
Well, not necessarily.
No.
I had a case like that where actually one of my researchers got funding to do research in Indonesia, and from the beginning of the project, they decided that they were going to commission an external impact evaluator. So there are companies out, this is in the environmental sciences, there are companies out there who monitor impact, and it's possible to commission them to do a piece of work for you. They accompany you through the project, but the work they do is specifically towards the end of the project. And for someone like me, an administrator within an institution who doesn't necessarily have a very detailed knowledge of the outcomes of a project that is very complicated over many years, and that is from a science, which is not my background, having someone there who could do very detailed work together with the PI was actually invaluable. And I would have liked to replicate that for other case studies we were working on, but the problem was one of resources. Obviously, you need the funding. You need to have included that in the budget pretty much at submission stage, right?
Okay, yeah, I can see how at the sort of program level or project level you could commission someone to carry out an evaluation. Yes, I thought the question was more about, say, Research England and the higher education funding councils commissioning um, evaluators to go and talk to universities and report back on what they saw.
Michelle herself suggests, for example, that we might think about follow-up surveys with people who've been involved in research to find out about what the long-term impact might be, and that being done external to the university, which I think is an interesting idea. We have a question from Carol Barron, a colleague of ours at the University of Kent, and she asks, public engagement is aligned more with the knowledge exchange framework with the addition of commercial engagement. And do you think this is something we will see more of in future? Do you think more alignment between a commercial agenda and the impact agenda? Perhaps I could ask Stephen about that.
I think the knowledge exchange framework is more about those pathways and mechanisms, and the impact assessment in REF is more about the actual impacts themselves, the end results themselves. So I think each has its place, and I don't know how things will turn out, but I wouldn't necessarily see them aligning, because I think they're two different assessments of two different phenomena. So that's my view on it.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to another clip now, because a lot of the upcoming series of this Next Generation Impact Series 2 is going to focus on academia after the REF. And we did briefly focus on this in the last series with the University of Kent's Professor Paul Phillips, talking about what exactly is impact based on the people's perspectives and how it should be measured. And Paul has a really interesting perspective on value in impact. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say in this clip.
If I may just reflect back on some of our conversation, I think we've made an assumption about something that's fundamental to the conversation. And the thing is, I remember I was doing a talk, Dr. Hill was there and Julie was there actually, and a few others were there. And there was one guy that was chairing our session, and very eminent individual, and he said, I don't know what impact is. And then I remember another panelist actually said, what is impact? Because basically impact should be what excites stakeholders. And one of my colleagues has talked about impact should really have feeling. So people who've experienced impact should have feeling. So I think that we talk about impact, but I don't think there's clarity as to what do we mean by impact. And I think part of that relates to the nature of the REF, because the REF focuses on outputs. So as an academic, you write your paper, that's the output. But in the business perspective, one's more worried about outcomes. How do you follow through and see these outcomes? I mean, I looked at all 400 and plus business case, impact case studies for Unit 19. And I tried to follow through the outcomes, but they were in a minority. Yet some of them scored really, really high. So I think we have to think about the phenomenon under investigation and clarify how we define it. But back to the question about post-COVID, or if we're in COVID, and about how that's going to affect institutions and strategic performance, I think it all goes back to something I said earlier, the business model. I think that in the HEI space, there is no clarity on business models. People say, oh, we've all rushed to online, but that's only part of the business model. There are other things that need to be done. Things like entrepreneurship, being entrepreneurial, for example, needs to be looked at. The governance mechanisms, because within a digital environment it gets digitized through a digital transformation project. A transformational leader can basically end up having staff that are depleted of all energy. And I think that is something that has happened in universities because, as being said, a lot of academics are actually depleted of all energy, and that can't be a good thing. So in terms of strategic performance, there needs to be better measurement of the intangible assets, i.e. the people, the talent management that takes place. Because again, when you go for appraisals, people talk about all these things, but at the end of the day, somebody sits there with their highlight pen, highlighting the number of 4-star publications you have written. And then if you've done enough, you get promoted. That is what's happening. We talk about change, but for the change to happen, there needs to be revised business models that allow the HEIs to deliver strategic performance. And when we say strategic performance, we're not just talking about economic performance. So I know about business-related issues in universities, people think, well, what's that to do with universities? But let's not forget, there are societal things that we can deal with, and also environmental. And things like the United Nations SDGs, they produce a nice arc into playing this new game. And I think that any assessment exercises should be linking to some external activity. SDGs, for example, are a classic one. And I noticed the Times Higher very recently published a ranking of universities, and I know the University of Manchester came at the top, and they've broken down by the different criteria. I think there needs to be a greater focus on the user, and at the academics looking at what problems are they seeking to do. Because going back to the portfolio approach, we can't have everybody doing blue sky research. There is room for blue skies research, but we can't have everybody doing it. And it all goes back to the phenomenon that we have created, the beast that we have created, that we're now looking at, and it is in need of fundamental change. I think to ensure that there is more equality in what's happening at the individual level and at the institutional level.
It's interesting to hear Paul talk about some of the changes he'd like to see in the way we do impact. And I'd like to wrap up this session just by asking each of you, what one thing, if any one thing, would you do to change the way we do impact? Stephen, perhaps I could start with you.
The way we do impact as a whole. So I think it's around something that Paul said, actually, around what excites people. And often when I talk to academics about their impact, they're in the same position that Paul described early on in his clip, where they have no idea what impact is, or at least what their potential impact is. But when we start talking about it, they start to smile, they start to understand what it is, and they start to get it. They go away seeing, this is what I can start to do. Yeah. So I think a lot of the hostility to the impact agenda comes from people not seeing exactly how they fit, how it's relevant to them. I think if you sit down and have a conversation, then you can start to sort of build that link and actually help people find what it is about the research that excites them. And often it is about creating a change in some policy environment, or in appreciation of some cultural thing, or in driving technology, that kind of stuff. So I think it's about sitting down and helping people to really find what excites them and what's motivating them about their research, and that will transform our approach to impact.
Thanks, Stephen. Perhaps I could put the same question to you, Rebecca. Is there anything you would change about the way we do impact? And if there's probably a panoply, but maybe just one thing that we can mention now.
In terms of real change in the real world, I think it's important to think in terms of non-standard impact. So both the kind of longer term impacts, your research can get picked up years later potentially and used in really interesting ways, but also unpredictable impacts in terms of the methods that you use and how that changes your discipline, or in terms of research governance and ethics and different ways of practice, I suppose.
Thanks, Rebecca. Perhaps finally, Alexandra, I could turn to you and ask the same question. Perhaps one thing you would change about the way we do impact?
Resources. I think we need resources to give more time to our researchers, and that brings a crucial question about workload, which is problematic. I think I see that on a daily basis. So yeah, resources, we need to think more carefully about that.
Well, thanks very much, Alexandra. I think it's good to have that balance between the excitement that comes from doing impact and the practicalities of needing the resources to have the time to work at it, because it is something that takes time. We've come to the end of our time, so many thanks to Dr. Rebecca Cassidy, Dr. Alexandra Luke-Pargle and Dr. Stephen Kemp for their words of wisdom today on impact and its measurement. And thanks very much to you for engaging at home. We've had a lot of engagement on social media. Sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we did get to some of them. Thanks for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again at another Next Generation Impact webinar. Thank you very much.
Everything that we do in the conservation department and all of the research that we do is to make sure that that collection remains stable for as long as possible so that people can come to the museum and immerse themselves in Tudor life.
These statistical ecologists have spent years passionately developing advanced mathematical models that are now being used in the field to map and manage butterfly populations across the world.
I've been working for, 7 years or so on a fascinating publication called The Ladies magazine, a hugely popular monthly magazine for women. I would certainly argue the first recognisably modern women's magazine.
We're working together with the University of Kent and other partners to really make it a real vaccine that you can use. The product is right here and not just in papers.